and thank you for joining us. My name is Mandy White, and I serve as the Chief Economic Development Officer of the Jackson Chamber in Jackson, Tennessee. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for the Japan America Society of Tennessee, or JAS. Thank you so much to those who have joined us today as we discuss for the next hour doing business with Japanese companies and what they mean to our state. Now, the Mitsui Lecture Series is made possible by the generous support of the Mitsui USA Foundation. JAS will present, or has presented actually, 3 virtual symposiums highlighting Japan's footprint around the world and its contribution to Tennessee's prosperity over the last 40 years. Before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, I want to touch on that last point about Japan's contributions to Tennessee. At the end of last year, there were over 200 Japanese establishments in our state, employing more than 52,000 residents and representing an investment of more than $19.5 billion. In fact, Japan is the top country for Tennessee foreign direct investment, and we certainly value our relationships and partnerships that have formed over the years. Now, we're calling this a panel, but really I'd like for it to be more of a conversation. If you're watching and have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we're going to try to answer your questions before the time ends. Panelists, please feel free to chime in as you have thoughts. You don't have to wait for me to call your name. Really, I think we've all been around a while and we all have a lot to offer and contribute, so please feel free to do so. So let's go ahead and chat. Today we have with us Brian Daniels, Victoria Hirschberg, and Elaine Middleton. Would the 3 of you briefly introduce yourself, sharing the organization you represent, what role you play within the organization, and a bit about your background? And Victoria, we'll start with you.
Hi, thank you, Mandy. Good day, everybody, depending on the time zone you're in. But my name is Victoria Hirschberg. I'm a Director of Business Development with the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. For those joining us from maybe outside the state, we are the state agency that is charged with creating prosperity through job creation and expansion, industrial expansion throughout the state of Tennessee. My role, I've been with the department for 10 years now, and my role is to help recruit new industry, particularly foreign direct investment, throughout the state of Tennessee. I live in Nashville. Nashville is home, but I have the privilege of working in all 95 counties. And so really excited to be here today, learn from my esteemed panelists that I work with every day, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mandy and JAS, for doing this.
Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you, Mandy. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you allowing me to be here with you and some of our colleagues that have been around for a while. My name is Elaine Middleton. I am Executive Director of the Fayetteville-Lincoln County Industrial Development Board, and I have been in economic development in this community for a little more than 13 years. So it's been a very rewarding career, and I've enjoyed working with all of my counterparts and Victorias of the world, and it's just been a great career.
Wonderful. And Brian?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Brian Daniels. I am President and CEO of the Blunt Partnership. It's a economic development and Chamber of Commerce tourism entity based in Maryville, Tennessee. I have been in economic development, it's hard to believe, 25 years now. I came with a governor's administration and got indoctrinated into economic development back in the 90s, and worked for ECD for a while, and before leaving, and working for a variety of communities. Been a great career, met a lot of friends, and especially have really gotten to know the Japanese culture and companies, and really are grateful for their investment in our state.
It's really evident once you have the opportunity to work with a Japanese company how quickly they can become friends, and I think all of us that have done that have experienced that. So let's talk about some companies with whom you've worked. Elaine and Brian, who are some of the Japanese companies that have invested in your area? Do you know when they arrived, how were they attracted there? And then Victoria, will finish with you, and maybe from a state's perspective, a little bit about your experience with Japanese companies that have located here or expanded, and maybe just why Tennessee in general is so attractive to Japanese investment. And Elaine, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay, well, us being a very small community, we have had several prospects come in on the Japanese level. Our first Japanese company we landed was in 2015. It was Nippon Steel. Victoria should remember that one well. We spent a lot of time with those folks. And like you said, they become friends and family. We had an existing spec building that they came in and took, and that was their first manufacturing facility in the United States. And they made a $5.7 million investment in our community and created 65 jobs. Like I said, we spent a lot of time with them over a course of about 12 months before they actually made a decision. And we came down to the final two. It was down between Fayetteville and West Virginia. And at the end of the day, we brought that one home. So we were fortunate to have them. And
Do you know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Do you know what, have they indicated to you what made you be the one that was selected?
Obviously, the ease to do business in the state of Tennessee. We had a workforce that was ready to go, and then relationships that were built during that 12-month period. We spent so much time with those folks. I mean, anywhere from taking them to find housing, to find Japanese amenities in this area, to letting one of the gentlemen overcome his fear of pets. As a small child, he had an encounter with a dog and he was frightened. Unbeknownst to us, we had no idea. So we take him to our downtown, and we've got this cute little pet store on the square. We walk into the pet store and the lady hands us a dog. Well, I turn around and hand it to him, and he looked horrified there for a minute. And then, you know, you could tell he had got comfortable with it. And then after we left the pet stores, when we found out that he had had an encounter with a pet at a young age. So, but I think it was really the relationships that we built with them over that 12-month period, and the easiness of doing business in Tennessee is what sold them, I think.
Thank you. Brian, what about the companies that you have there?
So we're very fortunate. The Japanese presence here has truly been transformational for our community. Before really their appearance, we were predominantly a kind of a one-horse town, if you will. Most folks worked at a facility here that had a lot of legacy, many decades of dominance and prominence in our community around aluminum smelting. And that began to diversify in the 70s, and in 1988, we were the runner-up on the Toyota facility, the OEM that went to Kentucky, and Toyota happened to bring us aside and said, but we have a consolation prize for you. It's a small little company called Denso, and they will have a small presence there, roughly 30,000 square feet. Now, fast forward over 30 years, and now they're over 3 million square feet. And they've had a real prominence here, and it's really added to the fabric of our community. Their stewardship in the community, truly been engaged. And from that relationship, we've born many more Japanese companies have located here. What we found with the Japanese culture is a lot of the relationships that are built within the companies lead to opportunities in the States. And so predominantly when we work projects in Europe where we had a lot of dominance, it was really driven by site consultants and really a process there. But with the Japanese, we found that relationship between Japanese companies of what they've seen doing business in the States, what were the lessons learned, they really hone in on those existing relationships in their industries. And so we've tried to foster dialogue with companies that are based here, companies that are based in Tennessee, trying to leverage those relationships just to get our message out there of we're open to their culture. A lot of East Tennessee looks like parts of Japan that we've been to, and you know, they're like many other companies. It's about efficiency. It's about the transportation network. Have you put your community in a position of positivity that a company could come there, land fairly softly, and be highly productive? And so, you know, we found with the Japanese, they're very focused on processes and also efficiencies. And you position yourself that way, you'll rise to prominence in their discussions.
Brian, I didn't realize we had so much in common. We were considered for the Toyota plant that went to Texas, and our consolation prize was Toyota Motor Manufacturing Tennessee, which makes all the engine blocks and transmission casings for North America. Originally a $100 million project. They've now more than doubled, almost tripled that, and are one of our 7 companies here. So there's something to be said about, I like consolation prizes if that's what they look like.
Yeah,
I'll take them every day.
absolutely.
Victoria, let's think a little bigger picture. You know, let's pretend you're trying to sell the state of Tennessee. What's been your experience in recruiting Japanese companies here? And then in your experience, what makes us attractive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, when I first, not a Tennessee native, but I've been here a long time. But when I first got into economic development in the state of Tennessee, understanding the tradition and the legacy of Japanese investment in the state of Tennessee is so important to why we have been successful in economic development over the past 40 something years. You know, when automotive manufacturing came to the U.S., Japanese automotive manufacturing started in Ohio, late 70s, excuse me. But when Nissan really came here in the early 80s, 1981 to Smyrna, Tennessee, that really started to spur a friendship, a relationship, and a pattern of investment that has continued throughout that. And yes, we've been fortunate with companies like Denso, that's in Brian's backyard, and some of the companies like Elaine mentioned, Nippon Steel, Hirotech, that are some of the tier 1, tier 2 suppliers for Toyota, Mazda. But really that going back to the early 1980s with the investment from Nissan, it just kickstarted a whole automotive legacy from the supply chain standpoint that has just been such an absolute just opportunity for the state of Tennessee. It also helps that we're centrally located, have a great business climate, have great people like Mandy, Brian, and Elaine working in all of our communities. But the one thing that I've learned through the years coming into this, you know, 10 or so years ago to the state of Tennessee is that there is a comfort and a relationship that has been fostered years before I got here that has made Japanese companies comfortable. When they know what they're expecting in Tennessee, there is a trust, which is so important when working with foreign companies, that when you're working with them across the table, you're taking them to pet stores, there is a trust that exists. And that is just has been utmost importance to working with Japanese companies. I've had the privilege of traveling to Japan several times. And I'm just going to mention, I will not ask my colleague, Yumi Mitamura-san, who is also on the line, but Tennessee for the past 15 years has maintained an office over in Yokohama for that very reason of making sure that relationship was always stable, either here in the state of Tennessee, but most importantly in Japan. And so Yumi, it is 4:10 in the morning in Yokohama right now, but has joined us. And I just want to say hi to her. Konnichiwa. But all that said is that having that complete stability and understanding from headquarters to the office here in Tennessee has been so important to our success in the state of Tennessee.
You know, it's not by accident that our panelists represent all 3 grand divisions of the state, with me in West, Elaine in Middle, and Brian in the East, and you, of course, representing the entire state. I was looking at a map on ECD's website yesterday at all of the Japanese companies, and we really do have them well represented in all areas of our state, showing that, you know, I think we all have something to gain by continuing to work with Japanese companies to support those who are here. It really affects our entire state in a great way. Well, you know, several of us have mentioned the word relationships a few times, and it's for good reason. We know that relationships are of utmost importance, particularly to Japanese companies. I remember, in fact, when Pacific Manufacturing Tennessee chose to come to Jackson in 2015, in his letter to the mayor, President Ogawa-san mentioned that above all else, the relationships his group had built with what we call Team Madison County made the difference of him locating here instead of somewhere else. And, you know, 2 expansions later and more than 300 team members later, we really are grateful that we were intentional about those relationships. So for the panelists, and we'll start with Brian this time, in what ways do you work to build and maintain relationships both here and in Japan with the companies that have either located or that you're courting?
Sure, that's a fair question. So For us, it's a multi-layered approach. For a long time, we had our own office, also in Yokohama, that we were continuing to foster relationships there, be an open door presence there. We've also found that leveraging the companies that we have here, we have roughly 6, all in a variety of different sizes in our community, from the 5,000 down to the actually 30-person shop. And we call on them regularly. We actually talk to them about where they see their business growth at, and actually try to be a strategic partner, that if there is a supplier, but really more of a business opportunity, that they could see maybe another company they partner with in another part of the world, could we help bring them here also and further investment? And for us, we don't just focus on Blount County. If it locates in our region somewhere, that's a win for us, especially in this day and time that we all struggle for labor force. We all have to cooperate in trying to figure out how do we leverage each other. So getting a company that locates the next county over, but has an opportunity to maybe employ some people here, that's a win for us. And I think the Japanese really appreciate that openness and honest conversation with them. We call on them regularly here. And then we also, in the past, we've leveraged JAS. Now we have it with the epidemic, of course, that put a halt on many things, but that's an opportunity to reconnect, at least get you over into Japan to meet other officials. It's really easy to leverage when JAST is in the States, but that's a resource that, that keeps goodwill, good ties, that also keeps a dialogue going, which in today's world, geopolitics is really important now. And I think Japanese appreciate that outreach and that constant reaffirmation of how strong our ties between Tennessee and Japan are.
Very, very good suggestions there. Elaine, how about you? How do you foster those relationships?
I mean, we've got great working relationships with our existing industries, but our Japanese in particular. And we talked about Nippon Steel, and then Hirotech Manufacturing was our second one. But back in 2018, as we were getting Hirotech, we actually lost Nippon Steel. But it was circumstances beyond our control, their control. They got pulled back to Japan. So a lot of the relationships there with Nippon trickled over into our courtship with Hirotech. They were familiar with one another, and they interacted some while we had one here and we were recruiting the other one. They were engaged, they spent some time together, talked with one another. So I think that kind of helped us to land one. And even though Nippon Steel was leaving, they were very complimentary of the community, how well we all worked together. And, the people in our community were the reason they were here. So that helped us, I think, to land Hirotech. I mean, as they were going out, they knew they were leaving. Hirotech did as well, and understood that it was not anything due to the state, the community. It was strictly corporate America that was pulling them back to Japan. So, and then with Hirotech, they have an office in Michigan. So we've traveled to their corporate office and stay in contact with them, because there's 3 brothers that kind of head up the Hiroshima facility, the one here and the one in Michigan. So they're in and out of our community a lot. We use them when we're recruiting, whether it's a Japanese company or not. They're the first to step up to say, how can we help you? You have a great community. We've got a great working relationship. And as the community grows, we want to be part of that. So if we can help to grow the community that we now call home, we want to contribute. They're very active in our community. They get involved with festivals, anything we've got going on, they're there to represent. So we've just had a great working relationship with the 2 that we have had. It's been very rewarding.
I think that, relationships on a local, regional, and corporate level are always important. It sounds like you guys are really tapped into those, and then just staying connected is really important. Victoria, same question to you, but maybe a little bit of an opportunity to pitch ECD's Japanese office, and how you how you maintain relationships both here in the States and then over in Japan.
Yeah, well, if it's any credit to our lovely working relationship, the fact that Yumi-san is here at 4:10 well, now it's 4:20 in the morning, but it is really important. And that's one thing that we've had a really challenging past 2 years where across the world, communication is more important than ever and reconnecting is more important than ever. And I know for one, Team ECD is looking forward to the opportunity to travel to Japan, hopefully sooner than later, as the world becomes a bit safer and that becomes more likely, more happen. But we've been fortunate throughout the years to have great events like SUS Japan. That happens 1 year in Japan, 1 year in the US, throughout the Southeast, sometimes it's in Tennessee, but has really served as a kind of a steadfast opportunity for people to connect with companies and with stakeholders and everyone that is doing business in Japan. And their long-term relationships, when you're talking about companies like Denso and that have been in town for 40 plus years, it's really important, particularly now as we're seeing a shift in automotive particularly, but a whole kind of industrial revolution, 2.0, 3.0, whatever 0.0 we're on. We need to be attentive to what's happening in the world. And Brian alluded to a bit about the geopolitical climate of everything happening around us right now. We can't ignore that. And it's particularly important when working with Japanese clients to pay attention to that. And one thing I'll just mention about Nippon Steel in Fayetteville, Tennessee, where Elaine was talking about that company. It was a truly sad day when they had to call Elaine and myself to say that they were closing their facility in Tennessee. Fast forward a couple of months later, that relationship sustained. One of the plant managers that actually was based here in state of Tennessee, in Fayetteville, Tennessee, came to SUS Japan to still be an advocate for the state of Tennessee. He now works for a consulting firm. He's since left the company. And I know all of this, and I know Elaine-san does too, because we still keep in touch with him. When my husband and I went to Japan on vacation a couple of years ago, him and his wife took us out to an izakaya and introduced us to wonderful food. And I have no doubt that that company or that person, because it's more than this, the company will come back to Tennessee and always pay that forward. And I think that's why we emphasize relationships so much. And that is why Tennessee has always, for many years, have maintained that office. And on years when we can travel, sometimes it's 2 to 3 times a year that we have either our commissioner, myself, or our team over there to meet with not only prospective companies, but also always understanding what's happening at headquarters. And that's always so important to what we do as economic developers, to making sure we're understanding all of any, the pathway to decision-making, any potential obstacles, ways to mitigate, and just be ahead and be in touch, in tune with that company.
Again, just relationships. I can remember my first year that I was planning a trip to Japan, and it was in 2015. And there are so many things you don't know, and even more, there are so many things you don't know that you don't know. And our existing industries really stepped up to the plate. I remember one of the presidents meeting with me to help me understand the train system, so that, because I had the mayors with me and they wanted to make sure that it was a good visit that went off without a hitch, and it did. And I can even remember another president, I'll embarrass myself, but I'm not much of a seafood fan. And obviously when you go to Japan, there aren't many options. And so he took me to a local Japanese restaurant, did not have to do this, bought almost everything on the menu and said, try every single thing and find something you like. Because, he wanted me to not embarrass myself when I got over to Japan. And, but for the friendships and relationships I had built, they wouldn't have gone above and beyond like they did. And I'm just grateful for those that we have. I'll remind those that are watching that you can ask us questions. We have a couple, and I'll touch on one right now and throw it to the panelists to discuss. Lori Odom asks, for the other economic developers listening in, can you talk about the nuances of working with Japanese prospects versus clients from other countries? For example, how decisions are made, data collection, site visits, etc. Ultimately, any tips for working with Japanese prospects that may be helpful? And Victoria, I'll start with you this time.
Well, that is a great question from my very esteemed colleague, Lori Odom with the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, who I know spent a lot of time in Japan. I would say that one thing, and I distinctly remember this moment in my economic development career, being in Japan with Yumi-san, and, everyone's, my flight was delayed 10 hours, all of the things that get you there to this space, and looking over at this whiteboard and a spreadsheet that they had. And I remember it so well because they had about 15 sites that were proposed in Tennessee, broken down in these cells. And I just remember always realizing the gravity of what we do as economic developers, and the fact that there are some real decisions made based on information that is sent over and received and whatnot. But there was a moment where you just remember it because somehow it changes you. But the attention to detail and the studying that they did on those very brief PDFs that my local partners have submitted to me, that I sent over and packaged up, what was all over their whiteboard, it was all over their desks, the spreadsheets. And, you just remember a moment like that because it felt heavy in a good way, because what we are doing is informing decisions. And I'm happy to report that that company is still very much engaged with the state of Tennessee, ebbed and flowed throughout the years. As we all know, as economic developers, there are sometimes projects that take 6 months, other times they take about 3 years. But the attention to detail, and I also think there is such a respect for detail, but hierarchy and formality and tradition. Candidly, when we start understanding some of the things that they liked, some traditions that they have, and I know that anyone on this phone call understands how to present your business card, how to sit properly around the table, how to make sure the right people are across. And I think there's something beautiful and just highly respectful about how they conduct themselves in business, and how we can do that as well. I certainly, as myself, I took two rounds of Japanese lessons, language lessons. So, konnichiwa, watashi wa Victoria desu. That's about my extent. I can count to 10. But while I was on a subway in Osaka once, I got schooled by a bunch of kindergarteners. They knew 1 to 10 in English way better than I knew it in Japanese. But again, trying to, just be attuned to some of the cultural differences, but also the things that make us closer as human beings, I think are important. And I would say, Mandy, I love that. And I know we've had this conversation, but about seafood, and you're not necessarily for that. And how many things I've tried in Japan that, have just been wonderful, but maybe not my favorite foods. But I think that's all just part of, being together and being in, trusting each other to lead us down a good path. And that happens in life, and that happens in business for sure, and in economic development.
Ditto to everything you said. A couple of things come to mind for me, and then I'll ask Brian and Elaine. But I think for us, what I have found is that the fun side of the visit is probably as important as the business side, and as formal as the business side is, the fun side is completely the opposite. But that's really where the relationship gets built and the trust gets built. And without that, really, I don't think you can go much further on the business side. And so for us, it's been the courting process. Has to be genuine, I think. And it's really easy for it to be, because in my experience, the Japanese are very easy to like and to work with. But it's that play side, I think, plays a key role, or at least has for us. Elaine, how about you? Anything that, in addition, Victoria did a great job of summarizing, but anything else that comes to mind about the nuances of doing business with Japanese that struck you in the past?
I mean, I echo everything she has said, because she has touched on it. I've been in those rooms with those whiteboards, and, it's draining, physically and mentally draining, but you understand the process behind that, because they're making the right decision for their company. But for me, that fun side was the Japanese, because they're in Tennessee, and, just as when you go to their country, they want you to experience Japan. So for me, it was giving them the Tennessee experience, particularly the Fayetteville experience, what we have here to offer, and then just seeing their reactions to that fun side, the fun things we were doing. Like I said, there was a course of 12 months with the Nippon Steel folks. I spent every holiday with them except for Christmas Day.
Oh.
So it was, and it was holidays that they did not celebrate, but they were in the US and they knew we did. So watching them enjoy that with us was really a lot of fun. They make what we do fun.
They really, really do. Brian, how about you? I know it's hard going last with this question, but anything else that comes to mind?
No, I guess I could add, just always remember that the decision is going to be made in Japan, that there is a process. And just think if you were relocating your company or expanding your company to another country, you'd be very hesitant, you'd be very cautious, you would want to do a due diligence. And that's already in the Japanese culture. So compound that, there is a process. It normally takes time. It is very exacting. I have been on both sides of winning projects and losing projects. And, there were Japanese projects that we lost because reports were lost in translation, meaning sayings or generalities that we have accepted as non-threatening or benign don't translate very well into Japanese. And it really throws up red flags when maybe none exist. And it's really hard to overcome that feeling. Once it's implanted, it's hard to overcome that. And so for the communities that are trying to court Japanese, the best advice I can give you is know your site, know your community, vet it. And if there are issues, go ahead and address those on the front end and really talk and show documentation, not just give it a marketing piece, but really get into the crux of whatever situation you're dealing with, because through the Japanese process and culture, they're going to discover anything at all. And it's better to be on the front end and trying to address it. Even things that you may dismiss as that's not an issue, they can come back and bite you. And I mean that in a very supportive way, in that it's a scary process for anybody, no matter what country you're from. And so that English to Japanese translation can sometimes be one that's hard to overcome. So some advice I would have there.
I think that goes back to there are some things we don't know that we don't know, and just really being really strategic and thoughtful about what it is you say and how you say it. A couple of other things that came to mind to touch on something Victoria said about hierarchy. Our mayors aren't always involved, especially in initial prospect visits, but where Japanese companies come into place, they absolutely are. And they're leading the meetings with our direction usually, but they are really super involved in those relationships with the mayors, and the respect that they have for elected officials really I've not seen in another culture. And then the last thing is being comfortable with silence, which I am not always, but really understanding you don't have to feel that silence. It's not necessarily something negative. Those are all things that we coach people who are just beginning to work with Japanese companies.
Mandy, if I could add,
Sure.
the silence brings a warm memory to me of where when I had first come to this community, the president of Denso here wanted to meet me in my first few weeks here. And needless to say, I found it to be a very intimidating process of this dinner they had set up. And so they would speak in Japanese and it would be translated for me. And that's where anyway, the point being, at the end of the night, after I had tasted just about every Japanese cuisine that some of them eat and some of them don't, but they never told me, they were I found them at the end of the night to be very playful, to be very warm. And then when you think that they don't speak English, most of the time they do. And that was part of the joke too, that I was indoctrinated very quickly, and we all had a good laugh over it. So I found them to be very warm, be very judicious in work, but very wonderful friends too.
For me, it's hard not to smile when I think about my experiences with Japanese companies, especially those playful experiences. We'll go to a question from the audience, and I'll just open this up to anyone who wants to answer. From Gretchen Niesler, how can the universities in the state of Tennessee help all of you in appealing to industry partners and bring value to your relationships with Japanese organizations? Anybody want to respond first to that?
I'm happy to.
Sure.
I think working with universities, there's obviously the university perspective of how in the recruitment process about education, about engineering, about the future pipeline. I do think it's so important when working with Japanese companies and really a lot of foreign companies is to have that sense that they're not alone. There are people certainly that are students studying from Japan here throughout our university system. There's companies, there's people who live here that have spouses and partners and children enrolled in our universities. And sometimes that connection is so important. And Brian touched on this, that they are coming to the United States, they're coming to Tennessee to invest a lot of money. I certainly couldn't go to Japan and pretend to, I would know the questions, but I wouldn't, you need help. And I think sometimes from a language perspective and also just a cultural perspective, it adds another level of comfort that is really important. And then of course, knowing that there are human capacity, there's talent, there's people that either exchange students and or students that are interested in their culture. And I think that's why JAST is a great organization, because it shows that there's this powerful collective interest in working with Japanese companies and understanding Japanese culture. We have cherry blossom festivals throughout the state that just kind of shows that extra level of understanding and that may be able to help just kind of go through their process with them and be an ally for Team Tennessee. I do think universities, I've certainly invited professors that maybe have not say nothing to do, but can't necessarily help the process engineering or something, but just adds that level of comfort that, hey, I'm Japanese and I live in Tennessee, or I have family here and I like to hike here, and things like that, or just sometimes go that extra mile when building that trust and that relationship.
I think too, inviting our Japanese companies to participate in their classes as guest speakers in their international business classes or others, hosting a Japanese business etiquette seminar for their students, anything that you can do to help the students here that are hopefully going to stay here to have an appreciation for the Japanese culture and influence, I think can be helpful. Elaine or Brian, any other thoughts on how universities can assist us better?
From my standpoint, I think you covered it.
Yeah, I think you two did a great job.
Good job, Victoria. We have one more question, and I'll remind the audience, just click that Q&A button. We have other things we plan to talk about, but we would much rather answer questions from you, so feel free to send those along. From Bob Booker, he says, y'all mentioned how Tennessee communities have changed and benefited from the Japanese corporate influence. How have you seen Japanese companies change based upon U.S. and Tennessee influence? That's a really good question. Brian, I'm gonna throw it first, and I'm trying to think too.
I know Bob well. Bob's a good friend of this community and does a great job for Denso. I will tell you what I have seen, and actually, it's funny Bob asked this. We've talked about this some. We've seen more Japanese companies get involved beyond just the local political landscape, but because of geopolitics, the way the world is now, I think it's inherent for them to get involved in that process, at least making known their trade, making known the opportunities they provide, but then also what can they do to assist. We live in a world and time now that this landscape is very dynamic and changing, and we want to see all of our companies engaged in our processes, making us all aware of the challenges they have, but also the opportunities they bring. We've seen some real positive impacts from Japanese in philanthropically also. We've seen them almost set the bar at times for in our area what community involvement, community engagement looks like. You know, the Japanese culture is one of very much of supporting their community, their fellow man, woman. It is, we've seen that really take hold here, and has been a wonderful asset to have. But I will tell you how I've seen them change mostly is being involved in that process, where before I think it was a little taboo, but now they realize that they need to be engaged in our forms of government.
Elaine or Victoria, any other thoughts there?
mean,
I'll
they've
just
got-
say that,
No, you go ahead.
I'll make this quick. I've never been in Japan discussing the merits of Roll Tide Roll versus Tennessee Volunteers from a Japanese woman who was explaining this to me. So if there's any influence from American football, it blew me away. But it's certainly wonderful to travel throughout the state of Tennessee and see how it works both ways, right? And I think that's actually one of the most rewarding things about what we do in economic development is to be in a small town and, you know, see a person who has been to Japan 150 times and speaks perfect Japanese, and you wouldn't know that, and vice versa. And so I do think there's just an absolute wonderful influence that works both ways. Bob, thank you for the question. And Elaine, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no. And we have seen them here in our community. Of course, we've got just a small community, but get engaged with our city county meetings. You know, they'll attend those meetings, they'll ask those questions because they want to understand how we function as a community and where they fit in as a company. So we've seen them step up to get involved here, which is very unique, I think.
Well, and very needed and welcome, I'm sure.
It is.
You know, for me, I can think that, you know, the Japanese are known for their work ethic and always have been and still are. But what I do think I have seen is while the expectation is still there of their U.S. team members, their American team members here, I do think there has been a deeper appreciation for that work-family balance. And so I have seen a little bit more flexibility in recent years than maybe 15, 20 years ago, as far as the expectations of the American employees that are working there. Still expectation of great work ethic. And thankfully in Tennessee, we have that to spare. You know, we are known for our work ethic, but just a little bit of an understanding of maybe that home life is important too, so you can be your best while you're at work. So we've talked about community quite a bit. I know in Jackson, our Japanese companies have invested over $1 billion here, much like you guys. They've gotten involved in, you know, they're great corporate citizens. They care about their community. Just anything else specific that you want to mention about something that they've played a key role in getting involved in, whether it's philanthropic, workforce development, education, those types of things. And Elaine, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, now back to Nippon Steel, as they were exiting out our community, they had obviously lots of equipment that they had brought in from Japan here. And what they did is donated it to our technical schools and our county high school to start training the folks here for future Japanese companies. And I've seen that with Hirotech. They're real engaged with our technical college here. They've gotten involved with high school STEM programs. So they're wanting to do their part to give back to the community. So they've been very, very engaged with our workforce piece of it.
Wonderful. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I would say workforce development has been paramount, what's been on their minds mostly, and that's from the large to the small, very engaged in that. I think some of the challenges at times could be maybe some of the history of how Japanese companies have approached workforce development, or, you know, we get into really the apprenticeships at a younger age and those sorts of things. Those at times can be challenges, but I am optimistic, and I see real growth for Japanese in looking at those apprenticeships, looking at younger labor forces. We talk about CTEs programs and those sorts of things. Of, you know, our state we're very much involved in the conversation of how do we get high schoolers some of that training before they graduate high school. And I do see the Japanese culture and employers beginning to coalesce around at least entertaining it, really embracing those apprenticeship programs, and have a lot of hope there. But yes, workforce development is where I've seen them all engaged the most in.
Victoria, I know it's harder maybe to answer on the state level, but does anything come to mind?
There's a couple of things, statewide initiatives that some of our Japanese companies have really taken an interest in, and that's everything from workforce to state tax, reform, things like that. Because it impacts, as Mandy, you mentioned, we have 200 plus companies. We have a lot of Japanese folks that call Tennessee home. So there's a business side, there's also a livability side. So we've seen, everything from, again, statewide initiatives, more on the political side, taking an interest, to making sure that past governors have always been welcomed over in Japan when we've done trade missions and visits over there. So I think the one thing that has been consistent, there's been involvement from our Japanese companies. And even if they're a very large company or a 50 job type operation that's, just on the supplier camp of Nissan or something, there's always been an involvement and some level of communication with what's happening either at the state level and or the local level. So that has been a consistent observation.
Well, and I can think too, of course, JAST is a membership organization. We exist to serve not only those of us that court Japanese companies, but really to be an advocate for and to work with our Japanese companies, many of whom are members, many of whom are on our board of directors and really are leaders within this organization. So I think the involvement in JAST is something that I can think of on a state level too, that has been really helpful. So looking at, the Japanese companies, I can tell you here, we want to make sure they feel welcome. We want to make sure they're respected, their culture is respected, and that they're appreciated, to the extent that, we've offered doing business with Japanese seminars, business etiquette seminars for those that would interface with them most often, such as bankers, hoteliers, realtors, our elected officials, so that, we may not always get it perfect. We may not do everything right, but I do believe that if you show that you are trying to show respect for the formality and for the culture, it goes a long way. So along those lines, what are other ways that you have helped Japanese companies feel welcome in your communities? And I guess really this is for Elaine and Brian. Elaine, anything that you've done as far as certain introductions or helping prepare your local business leaders to help them feel welcome?
And we did just as you did with in particular, the mayors and our elected officials, on how you greet them and, the hierarchy of when we're doing dinners or luncheons and things of that nature. We've introduced them to several of the banks locally. We have helped all of them maneuver in the housing market locally, find them all a place to live as they're coming in and out. So really just building the relationships between them and the folks in our community. It's been for us because, we are a smaller community, and they do interact with a lot more folks here than they do in a large community because they see these people every day, whether it's at lunch or, at dinner. So we've spent a lot of time trying to get them engaged in how they address them and, the hierarchy, the things of that. And it has worked well. And the ones that we've interacted with our elected officials, then their colleagues and their friends, that's trickled down to them. And I've seen that happen at restaurants during lunch or whatever. Our elected officials are, introducing them, and it's fun to watch because, they've actually listened and they've picked up on that. So it's fun to watch that.
You're watching just, okay, use two hands.
You
the business
cringe.
card. Yes, when they get it right, it's great. And
Yes,
I bet it's not gone unnoticed by your Japanese investors.
We've got a great group of Japanese in the community, and they're in and out quite a bit right now because Hirschberg just started full production probably 3 months ago. So we've got a lot of the Japanese from Hiroshima in and out of the community, the ones coming in from Michigan. So it's great to have them here. But they've been great partners.
Good. Brian, what about you?
So for our community, we've tried to be sensitive to the Japanese culture. When we first started bringing those type companies here, we founded the Japanese Saturday School here, which morphed into the Saturday School for East Tennessee, predominantly is here. We spend a lot of time making sure that whenever there are leadership changes within our Japanese companies that are here, we make sure they're in front of our leadership at some informal reception, or at least quality time, more than just sitting in a stuffy state dinner, but really spending some quality time together. And I don't mean I saw Victoria's reaction.
Don't call us stuffy, Brian.
I did not mean a state of Tennessee dinner. What I'm talking about is we all know the type of dinners where you're trying to make small talk. So we try to think beyond that. What's really something fun and activity to do with our leadership. But then moreover, one of the things we do is invest in our leaders, and we take them to Japan, because it's easy to try to think you know the culture from several thousand miles away looking at a globe. It's different when you get there, and we are very intentional in making our leaders go with us, spend quality time with those Japanese leaders in their own country, and try to understand them. So that's kind of what we do.
There really is no substitute for going there yourself and witnessing it and experiencing it yourself. And I know on our first trip, we were advised to plan a couple of days of just learning the culture first. Before we had any meetings, we had a day and a half where we just experienced Japan. And I can't remember who gave me that advice now, but I'm so grateful, because to be able to recall those experiences at our meetings, you could just tell how proud they are, as they should be, of their country and of the things that they have there, and to be able to comment on those with firsthand knowledge. I really think it was appreciated. And so for those that are watching and haven't been to Japan, I would say, we don't have the luxury of several days. I understand it's very busy, but at least a half day, at least one day, go and experience the culture before you start having your meetings. I think it'll make you more effective when you have those meetings. I think I'd be remiss if we're talking about business community if I don't mention the presence of the Consul General of Japan, Matsumoto-san, here in Tennessee, of course, with an office in Nashville. The Consul General's office has been supportive of our efforts here, attending meetings, providing letters of welcome to our companies, providing opportunities to grow Japanese culture and education, along with providing support for the Japanese residents that are here with companies. Just last night, we had one of our Japanese companies that has some wind damage to their plant, pretty significant, in fact, and I reached out to the consul's office with the hope that, perhaps someone from there can reach out just to offer support, just to have a friendly counterpart to acknowledge the situation. And they were eager to assist and step in, and I know it's going to mean a lot for the company. So I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that that presence of having them here in our state of Tennessee, while they serve a larger area, is certainly a benefit to us here in Tennessee. And of course, JAST, membership-based organization. Our mission is to strengthen a vibrant bilateral economic future for Tennessee and Japan by building upon long-standing relationships and promoting mutual understanding. And really, I think that's a lot of what we've been discussing here, is just a mutual understanding and respect for each other's culture. And that's what JAST does and has done for years. There's one more question, and then we'll close. Have there been any discussions if the state of Tennessee will accept Japanese driver's license similar to what the state of Maryland and Virginia have taken? And Victoria, I think that, at least in the past, I know that Tennessee accepts, I believe, the Korean driver's license. Have you heard if there are any talks of accepting Japanese as well?
I do not know. So what I'm going to do is I will follow up with Yumi-san, and we will double check that, and happy to provide that information back to JAST to distribute. I don't want to misspeak.
Thank you so much. That's a great question, David, and something that I think would be very welcomed by a lot of our, not only those that move here with companies, but trailing spouses and family members that are here too. So getting close to the end, I just want to ask you guys, maybe for those who have traveled to Japan, is there a special memory that you have, something that makes you smile when you think about your trip? And Victoria, you've probably been more than any of us put together, so I'll start with you. I'll just say we have about 5 minutes left, so about 3 minutes among us to answer this question.
I think Japan, Tokyo, all of the cities that I had fortunate to visit for fun and pleasure that I spent 10 days there on vacation, and let me tell you, that is a very different experience than going there for business travel. And just amazing memories, beautiful country, beautiful people. And I was in New York City 2 weeks ago and literally said, I will take the subway in Tokyo any day before I get on the New York City subway. And I am from New York City. That all said, I'll just share this little thing just because we're in this virtual environment. I'm here at my desk at my house. I have this random cupcake. I got a picture of my best friends. But I also keep this card, which you can't see, but maybe you can see that. This card was mailed to me. It's a season's greetings card from the two gentlemen that started that plant in Fayetteville, Tennessee, back in 2014, 15, a long time ago. Elaine-san, myself, and other people on the state team and TVA worked incredibly closely with that team to make that decision, and that was a learning opportunity for me as a new statewide person in Tennessee, project manager. And I keep that card on my desk because one, it's a beautiful card, but it also just reminds me of all of the work that goes into everything that I do every day to help foster an environment for investment across the state of Tennessee. It reminds me of the humanity of what we do, that people are people. And it brings me a lot of joy, even though that company has closed, that relationship continues personally, and it continues with a lot of other Japanese companies. So I keep that on my desk as a daily reminder. And I think of all the wonderful memories I've had in Japan. Particularly the bottom floor, if I could just make a recommendation to go to the bottom floor, the food section of Mitsukoshi department store. Pro tip, everyone, for traveling there. But anyways, I just wanted to share that just because I literally look at this card every day when I'm at my computer at my desk. And that truly is a great memory and experience. And I do encourage everyone when times are safe to be able to travel to the countries and experience it that we particularly do business in.
Elaine or Brian, any special memory that you have?
And to just kind of follow up with Victoria, the gentleman she's talking about, he was a wonderful man. I have several of those cards. I have his daughter's wedding picture. I have a picture of he and his wife, his two daughters, his grandchild. But when I was fortunate enough to go over in Japan in 2016, he was here stateside working. But I went over a few days early with Jazz. We had a study mission, and I got to spend an entire day with his wife and his daughter. And that's a day I will never forget. It was the most wonderful day. They are the most wonderful people, and they're great colleagues to work with, but I feel like they're lifelong friends now. I mean, we stay in touch. I get updated pictures of both of the grandchildren, and it's just, they're wonderful, wonderful people. And that's a day I will never forget.
Very special. Brian, 1 minute. Anything that comes to mind?
I will just make it brief. Just imagine, you can't see this from the computer screen, but I am a 6'6" football player. And when I went to Japan, the CEO of this company I went to see, we went beyond the dinner. He brought me to his home. I met his family. I met his kids. We had dinner in his home, and it was comical that night of my getting around their home with my size that I am. And to this day, we have fond memories of that. I found them to be very playful and very friendly and fun.
Very warm, very warm. Well, I want to thank you guys, Brian, Elaine, and Victoria, for giving up your time to participate today. I have enjoyed speaking with you guys, and I hope those that are watching have learned something and have enjoyed our experiences too. We, of course, want to thank the Mitsui USA Foundation for its support of JAST and specifically for its support of this series. This is the third and final of this year's series of discussions. If you'd like to access this for later or either of the previous two discussions, please please visit JAST's YouTube channel or its other social media platforms. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.